Hello and welcome to the groundbreaking trauma docuseries where we explore the healing power that lies deep within us. I'm Dr. Pedram Shojai, the Urban Monk.
And I'm Nick Palizzi, founder of The Sacred Science. In our last episode, we explored the effects of emotional trauma. In other words, the way it changes our mind and body. Mental health issues, eating disorders, even physical illness can all be brought on by traumatic events.
Now, in this episode, we're going to be looking at the brighter side of trauma. And the good news is there is one. It can lead to spiritual growth and a new sense of purpose, but getting there's the trick.
The loss of a loved one creates a ripple effect of emotional traumas. The grief can spread like a virus, overwhelming multiple parties. Each one of them will be affected differently by the loss, and each one must find a way to deal with the trauma.
Beyond the grieving process, the shock of losing a loved one can also have a physiological and neurological effect on the body. Feelings of anxiety, irritability, hopelessness, pessimism, all are common reactions to the emotional trauma of loss.
The journey of healing from emotional trauma is a long one, and in many ways, it's a constant work in progress. However, the rewards are immeasurable, especially when compared to the damage our bodies endure as a result of hanging on to it. Hanging on to trauma can literally kill you. Letting go of it can save your life and open it up in ways you never saw coming. Here's Pedram to fill us in on who'll be sharing their stories today.
Today, we're going to hear from Jody, Ruchira, and Christian, all of whom suffered immense soul-crushing losses, but have since emerged on the other side. Their experiences are as different as their backgrounds and their journeys. In the end, the emotional trauma of losing a loved one set them on a course that led to a new purpose in life.
My son and three of his good friends went on a road trip to, we live in Seattle, and they were going to an area called Leavenworth. Their dad was trying to pass a semi, and the car flipped 4 times. My son Max was killed on impact. His best friend Nico died 2 months later, and his friend Leo died 4 months later from traumatic brain injuries.
I would say, trauma is any kind of real shock to the system, to the psyche. Can be physical trauma, can be abuse, can be sexual trauma. It can be a single event, it can be prolonged emotional abuse. It has a lot of different definitions. It's sort of like depression, which means lots of different things, and all get subsumed under the same category. So, I would say, trauma is any kind of real shock to the system.
What I see in terms of trauma is when someone, when the fabric of their life has been broken in some way, but their fundamental sense of belonging and sense of ease isn't there anymore.
Growing up in India without a father, and with 3 daughters, that was challenging, and that had significant impact on my life. And then I immigrated at age 14, and my mom stayed behind, so second loss of parents, and being raised by relatives here in U.S. And then joining the Navy at age 17, at young age, because I have no place to go, I was a prey to 2 different military sexual traumas during my young military career.
Shock trauma is very often what we think of. We think of vets at war, we think of rape, we think of, physical abuse. But you can even think of shock trauma being going to the dentist, right? And as a kid, and being kind of put under for a procedure, or having to hold your mouth still as they're in there with their drills. And so that we have to learn to overcome terror, right? And so what is terror? Terror is the lack of a response to a situation that feels overwhelming, right? And so we know there's different strategies. We can freeze And in that freezing can be a dissociative process, or it can just be a muscular pattern of making everything really still and, of course, holding back the impulse to run or to fight. But you can't really do that as a kid, right? So shock traumas, there's a whole range of shock traumas.
The grief model it didn't seem like it was the most obvious fit for me. Like, I think that when the trauma first hit, I was in shock. And I think shock is the precursor to almost any grieving process. And shock requires treating shock, helping to desensitize the shock, take it out of your body. Like, one of the things that we know about shock is it's kind of that freeze mode, right? You have fight, flight, or freeze. And what happens to the animal in the wild, right? The lion's chasing him. He runs really fast. And if the lion catches up to him, sometimes he'll play dead. He'll go into shock. He'll be paralyzed, because sometimes that wards them off. Or, if you can fight, you fight. If you can run and escape, you run and escape. If you can't, you freeze. And this is what often happens to rape victims, is they somehow go out of body or they just freeze. But when you freeze, you never shake off that trauma. That trauma is still in your system. And that's what can lead to health issues down the line. So when any trauma occurs, I think the most important first step is to do something to deal with the shock.
Whenever we're in danger or there's a threat, then there are a couple of biological responses that come into play. One, which both of them, fight or flight. One is fight. Fighting is about setting a boundary. It's a very aggressive way of setting a boundary, but it's setting a boundary. Flight is about running away. It's getting out of town so you don't have to set a boundary per se.
You've experienced a range of trauma. As a psychiatrist, you now share with others what you've learned from it. How do you define emotional trauma?
There's an official diagnosis for psychiatrists that we use for trauma, and that defines trauma as any event where there is either a perceived or direct threat. It could be in the form of threatened death, severe injury, assault, sexual violations. And these events induce significant response or emotional response within us. It could be anywhere from fear to feeling of helplessness, that sense of horror, but it doesn't have to be limited to just those. It could be a sense of embarrassment. There could be a sense of guilt, shame, sorrow, any of these events.
Trauma can be seen as a boundary rupture. Basically, trauma is something that happens too soon, too fast, too much. For the integrity of the person's own boundaries, and that can include physical boundaries, emotional, spiritual boundaries.
One of the challenges with shock trauma, which is to approach that experience gently without re-traumatizing the person, right? So how do you wind your way down that road to be able to disentangle these things that have, in a sense, cohered together in that moment?
It seems that grief can cause many emotions in us, and we know there are stages of dealing and processing it, right? Can you talk about how anger plays a role in grief?
So if I hear someone talk about feeling bitter or resentful or holding grudges or they're cynical and they're pessimistic, in my mind, those are grief signal words. That there's grief underneath that, and that's why they're holding on to the bitterness or the resentfulness. So they're in a non-forgiving state because they're tied into the past in certain ways. And again, it doesn't have to be a distant past, it can be a recent past, but they're holding on to an emotional state that doesn't allow them to lead a more loving, freer, kind of fuller life.
We always went to the same beach spot for our winter break. And my son was 12, and he liked really bad rap music and, was very chatty, never stopped talking. So we would be driving from the airport to our condo, and I would think, God, this is such a beautiful drive. I wish I could just have a moment of peace. Like, he never stops. And there were pretty places along the way that I always wanted to stop, but we would go every year, so he'd have friends that he was excited to see. So we never did. So he passed away in August, and I had already booked our trip. So my daughter brought a very sweet friend, and I was driving from the airport on this beautiful road, and it was so quiet and calm, and I missed him so much. I just got so emotional and so sad that, it's so funny, be careful what you wish for. Like the clean house, the quiet drive, because when you get it, it's not, his absence was just so palpable.
There's already this guilt and shame. Essentially guilt means I did something wrong, or I could have prevented this, or I should have done something. And then shame is essentially that I'm a bad person, that I'm a weak person, or maybe I deserve to have this happen to me.
I think when people are physically traumatized, in some ways it's easier to deal with because there's a clear traumatic event. And when you're more emotionally abused, I think people tend to blame themselves. I think people tend to blame themselves in either case often, and feel they deserve it in some way. But the emotional abuse is much more insidious in certain ways.
We have to start with guilt, the feelings that we talked about where you feel that this is my fault, or I did something wrong, or or the shame part where I'm weak or I'm bad. And working through those also means forgiving ourselves, right? Because if we're not forgiving ourselves, we're still ruminating about this. There's still a lot of guilt. There's a lot of shame.
Fear is another unfortunate factor that people with unresolved trauma seem to deal with. What can that lead to if it's not addressed?
Anger takes different forms, right? It takes external anger, it takes self-blame, and then it takes this idea of shame, where you take other people's projections and internalize them. And one of the critical factors of shame is that you're so embarrassed or humiliated that you don't talk about it. So I think the more you can really speak what's on your mind and process through it, it's almost like in speaking those words, it releases it from your body and allows you to flourish and not be stuck.
I, fortunately and unfortunately, had a big T trauma where I had the death of a loved one, a parent, my mom, when I was in school, of breast cancer. Up till then, I realized that we don't learn much about trauma or how to handle it or what to do, especially in American society. We don't talk about it, just like we don't talk about death. So that trauma was really important in the direction that my life took, as far as professionally, but also spiritually, the way I saw life occurrences and the way I put myself relative to that experience. So all of a sudden, I was reactive to life. That death happens, and then you become sort of a player in what you are creating in your reality and how you're experiencing it. It's really interesting shift because we get these gifts through trauma.
I think that when we hold on to resentment and anger, it affects the person holding on to it more than the other person. And the more people are able to let go of that, and it doesn't mean forgetting. I think one thing, and often our kind of medical model is to try to make feelings go away. The idea that you should never feel depressed, even if you've experienced a terrible loss, and that there's a value in going through it. I don't think you get over things. I think you get through them. And part of getting through it is forgiving your own role.
If there's unresolved trauma, or if there's an inner state of hyperarousal or anxiety, we're gonna be more fearful. We're gonna see threat in places where maybe it's not there, but we're not going to be able to recognize that it's not there.
So the goal then to make one's way through the trauma to forgiveness, it's to make sense of the impact and the meaning that those life experiences So we make sense of the impact and meaning it had for us across time. We extract the good. Then we move to a place of forgiveness. Then that's the point where I think people can really let go of whatever that past was, because they've been able to take the good from it and move on.
Certainly when it comes to forgiveness, that plays a major role. I work with all different types of cancer, but I see a lot of breast cancer patients. And there's always a role of trauma and forgiveness. And I've seen people take the best supplements on the best protocol and the best diet, working out, marathon, triathlon athletes. But it's not until they truly forgive either themselves or someone they need to forgive from years ago. And sometimes it's even hard to remember who you need to forgive. That takes the deep work. But when they have that process of forgiveness, then you start seeing major changes in what they're experiencing physically. And I'm a firm believer as a naturopathic doctor that the physical is just an end-stage manifestation of what's bubbling under for quite a while. And what we see what's bubbling under for quite a while is those traumas, is those lack of forgiveness, is those self-sabotaging dialogues that we have. But truly, one of the most liberating things that we can do for ourselves in our mental and psychological health is forgiving ourselves for that which we believe that we wronged ourselves, others, something that wasn't in line with who we believe we are. And that liberation manifests in our body in ways that we won't ever realize.
When we look back on hard times, if we have the willingness to change our perspective, we might be able to see it's a blessing. What's one unexpected gift you've been given with your trauma?
My friends have been amazing, and that's been something I've had to learn as well, because I was so independent and capable. Like a friend described it as, I got the baby, I got the groceries, I don't need help. So I had all these wonderful people in my life, but I never could really accept what they were trying to give me. And then when Max died, I was so incapable of doing anything. Like, I don't even know if food showed up. Somehow the funeral got planned. There were people that were there to drive my daughter. Like, people just showed up, and I was so incapable of saying, like, no, I got this, that I accepted it. And that's been kind of an unbelievable gift, because I feel like the friendships that I had have deepened. There were people in my life that probably weren't the best fit for me, but because everything was kind of fine, I tolerated them, and they've kind of exited from my life, making way for people who are a better fit for me. So that's been a real blessing.
Life will always give you exactly what you need, and it'll always manifest as a person, place, thing, situation, or circumstance. Something you call for, and this is to get a little esoteric, but whatever you need to heal that trauma, you will get over and over, right? Some people are in relationships and they go, man, that person pushed my buttons, I had to break up with them. Okay, well, the next partner manifests that in the same way, or a little bit different way, but still the same wound is being exposed over and over and over until you have that realization and go, well, maybe the universe is creating a self-healing mechanism by creating these people, places, things, situations, circumstances to present, so I can finally look at my own wounds and heal them. So that, just understanding that something is on our side for our healing, should give us peace of mind, because we're not in this alone. There's some inextricable force trying to heal us always, just like a cut is always healing on its own. There's psychological and emotional wounds always being inextricably healed by a force outside of us.
At its core, trauma is a shock to the system, an event or series of events that disrupts what we perceive as safe and normal. The tragic accident that took Jody's son, the cancer that took the parents of both Ruchira and Christian, or the sexual abuse Ruchira experienced in the military. Traumas like these have profound effects on our lives. The emotional pain from them far often outweighs the physical in many cases. Let's review the emotional effects of trauma that can trigger self-destructive behavior and prolonged pain. Trauma is a disruptive force against our sense of normalcy. The first response is shock. Shock, that first splash of cold water sends the body and brain into a reactive mode: fight, flight, or freeze. The secondary response to trauma is emotional. Guilt, shame, bitterness, fear, all are tied to grief. Over time, grief turns to anger if not reconciled. Long-term anger can destroy lives. Learning to recognize the symptoms of trauma is the first step to healing ourselves.
I hope you're enjoying this episode. We'll pick it back up in a second, but I first want to take a moment to tell you how you can access the entire trauma series on Whole TV. On this platform, you'll find a link to the full docuseries as well as a vast library of other health and wellness content. It includes a bunch of powerful bonus materials that you can bring into your home at a special discounted price. This includes a trauma companion guidebook that's packed with powerful takeaways and action items from each episode. We're talking deep dive comprehensive wisdom that's not included in what you're seeing here. On top of that, we'll be hosting exclusive live stream events where you can ask questions directly to some of the experts you see in these episodes. If you're interested in bringing these powerful healing solutions into your life, it's well worth checking out.
In this next segment, we're going to explore how we can work through the shame we carry with us after a traumatic event.
People who suffer intense losses, like that of a child, parent, or loved one, or who experience sexual assault or emotional abuse, often tend to blame themselves. This can bring on intense feelings of guilt.
It's this release of guilt, the letting go, that allows us to take the next step in our lives with greater purpose and heal our relationship with the trauma.
Our traumas will always be a part of us, but they don't have to govern our behavior in negative ways that harm us or our loved ones.
To the contrary, what we learn from our trauma can set us on a new course in life, one with a higher calling. But the road there is difficult and at times overwhelming. That's because confronting our pain is not natural. Our bodies are created to do just the opposite. We avoid pain and we seek pleasure. Dealing with our trauma takes high levels of awareness and courage. Unfortunately for some, the grief associated with trauma is too much to bear. It can lead to self-harm and in extreme cases, suicide. Here's Nick with a segment about loss and the many levels of grief that it can come with.
When someone experiences a traumatic death of a loved one, they must cope with the trauma and their grief. These are two entirely different experiences. Thousands of people have to tackle this emotional tornado every day. In this next segment, we continue the stories of Jody, Ruchira, and Christian as they confront the deepest edges of grief associated with trauma.
In my experience, most people think of suicide as an action. Somebody's going to go physically somehow take their life. It is that, except the first way I think about suicide is that it's a communication about unbearable or intolerable feeling.
My husband was Swedish, so he was from Sweden, and again, he was a kind of a metro man, and he joined the military by not choice, but because, he was married to me, and we moved, and he experienced all these stressors and difficulties, and he struggled with depression, and I returned from my second deployment. Pretty much for him, the marriage was over. While we were going through the divorce proceedings and deciding who would get children's custody, because we were stationed in Hawaii, he wanted to stay in Hawaii, and I had to move back to mainland for my last tour. I didn't want to leave my children there, and so we were, in the family court. He had a temporary job, but he lost that, and he committed suicide. He committed suicide 3 days before my son turned 12. My daughter was 10, beautiful children, smart, fun-loving children. That did not give him meaning to continue with life, and so rationally, to me, does not make sense to give up on life like that. I don't know how people do that.
The statistics for suicide are on the rise. And we need to be aware as a culture and as a society of the needs of people who are being moved towards suicide.
It's difficult. There's lots of fear, about how people perceive you when you openly talk about that. There's a lot of fear for my children. I have an 18-year-old and almost a 16-year-old daughter.
I think there's a certain level of hopelessness that comes with it, and people who are feeling a lot of pain and they don't see another way to cope with it. I've worked with very many suicidal people over the years, and they typically have a sort of tunnel vision that they just want the pain to go away. And the only thing that will solve that is harming themselves or killing themselves.
It's the second leading cause of death between age of 10 to 34, and fourth leading cause between age 35 to 60.
In the English language, there's probably no word that communicates how despairing I feel or how much I'm in an unbearable or intolerable state than to use the word I'm thinking about hurting myself or I'm suicidal. So the first place my mind goes, depending on the level of risk, is to try to make sense of whatever that unbearable or intolerable emotional pain is. Because if we can get to that, we may be able to help prevent the suicide.
Here I was, a psychiatrist. It was my job to help people, to keep them from getting to that point. And the sense of guilt and shame that comes with that, it's taken me 6 years to overcome that. It's been difficult to talk about it. Only a few close friends and family members know about it. But I had to decide that I had to be courageous to come forward and share that information. So even if one person can be helped with what I've gone through, even if one survivor can be helped to understand that there's way past all these negative feelings.
And they don't see also in the midst of it how destructive it is to people around them. Family members never recover often from a family member's suicide.
When you hear about suicide, whether it's somebody that you knew or a close family members, it's a gut-wrenching reaction that we have. It's it's a different type of sensation or feeling or experience that we have. The other aspect of suicide is that when we look at the impact that it has, not just on the person who has committed suicide, but also the survivors of suicide. Suicide is called a quiet epidemic, and it's an worldwide epidemic. The latest numbers that I have read about show that there are 800,000 suicides occurring per year, which comes down to one suicide every 40 seconds.
Often people will not share their plan to commit suicide. And so in working with people as health professionals and mental health professionals, that is one of the things that we work with, is to really help the person to feel safe to share what is going on for them, and to find out what are some of the factors at the root of that hopelessness.
When people are losing purpose in life. They no longer see any meaning with their struggles. When their suffering just is so great and overwhelming, that's what leads to suicide. And so having those connections are very important.
Trauma impacts us individually in so many different ways. As a functional neurologist, what kind of physiological impact do you see trauma having on your brain?
So the way I look at trauma, it's an unwanted life event that really it creates undue suffering, and it changes in a really negative way the set point of our nervous systems and our brains. It leads to a contraction and a shrinking of our cells and of our life force energy. And if trauma is not addressed appropriately, the resulting fear and anxiety and stress that comes from it can be permanently lodged in our nervous systems, changing how we look at ourselves and the world around us.
The left brain's a really funny thing because the left brain wants perspective. Okay, so how we survive trauma a lot of times is we go into a bird's eye view and go, okay, I'm not even there. I'm just not even a part of it. And some people talk about soul retrieval as sort of retrieving the bits of us that left when we were traumatized. So the left brain wants information. It wants memory, not just as a validation of its distress, but actually so it can decide how it feels about it, which is hilarious if you think about it. Children don't decide how they feel. Watch them. They just feel things, and then ideally are safe enough to tell you how they feel. So left brain's kind of a goof here. It's like, I want to know everything, and then I'll decide how I feel about it. It doesn't work that way, but that's what the left brain wants. So when the topic of memory comes up for people who are working on trauma, usually I tell them that 0 to 3, you're not going to have a lot anyway, but also during highly traumatic events, that cortisol secretion does block memory formation or distorts it.
In medicine, we know that a trauma on the physical level is anything that will overwhelm the body's ability to heal on its own. And on the emotional level, it's a similar definition in the sense that anytime our psyche, our emotional state, as well as our physiology is overwhelmed to the point that we are unable to cope, an overwhelming event or crisis.
What's really beautiful about trauma is that it does point a map to where we need to meet it in order to resolve it. So these things that we're often wishing weren't the case, like I wish I could think more clearly, I wish I could sleep, when you get support with somebody who helps kind of midwife trauma into a different state, those things are the places that are helping us know this is where we need to go in order to connect with you and bring you somewhere else.
The left brain is very good at anger. It wants to do something about what happened, so it wants information. It wants the memory to tell it and to know who did what and when or what happened. So it can what? Heal? Not usually. So it can blame, so it can be angry, so it can stay hurt, so it can be upset. What I've learned about nervous systems is the right brain and body are so ready for love and to be healed that mostly what they need is a general context of what is possible, and what they need is what they didn't get. They don't need to know exactly what happened. A general idea of it can be helpful so that they can tolerate the context for why they might be hurt.
But the trauma itself is actually the person's response to the event. And that's going to be affected by many aspects of their ability to cope. And one of the big things we look at with that is resilience. What's their ability to bounce back? What's their window of tolerance for the events that are happening?
So when there's trauma in the system, the body, in its brilliance, wants to let us know about it. And the way the body lets us know that there's trauma in the system is it gives us symptom. Unwanted symptom, but it gives us symptom.
And so when people react again with outrage, we might say, are they connecting to the part of them that is hurt when they are outraged? No, because the outrage offers the hurt part of them no comfort. Actually caring about the part of them that was hurt means saying, we are so sorry that you live in a time where this is still happening. And also, you are probably one of the courageous souls that took on this kind of journey to transmute that poison, to change the world for better by absorbing a lot of suffering and radiating something different. That's a way different way of looking at victimization than most people have. It's a way of being proud of yourself for having taken on a larger chunk of this problem and doing something about it by absorbing it and radiating something different in the world. To me, those are the heroic people. The people who have been through the most are the people who have taken on the most pain that we're dishing out here, and they're trying to change it. That's a huge effort.
Sometimes even getting out of bed might be too overwhelming after a major trauma. What's your advice on moving forward in your everyday routine after experiencing trauma?
I think what's hard is when there's a trauma, you can't necessarily just go back to life the way it was. You really have to acknowledge something has changed and allow yourself to change as well. Because, you can't, I can't go back to having a boy and a girl. Now I have a girl. I can't rewind time and do things the way I used to before. I have to find new ways of doing that. And that's actually a conversation my daughter and I have had multiple times. Like, how do we do this now? Our life is different. How do we show up differently? How do we make, the two of us a family? What rituals do we start to do that are just us, that honor him, but honor him in a way that, is remembering and positive and not sad?
One of the most incredible things was my first breathwork class when I was there, and I had never done breathwork. I kind of didn't even really know what it was. But being able to inhale, exhale for just going and going and going, what I realized, and I had mentioned to the group that I personally am not a crier. I haven't really cried much, not really much when my mom passed away. But there was a force within that was pushing those tears out that was beyond me, was beyond even my ego going, let's suppress this as a man in society today and let those tears out. The same goes when it comes to psychedelics. Psychedelics also bring you to a place where it shuts off that ego, just like breath work. Breath work forces it physiologically. Psychedelics forces it via the chemical reactions in your body. But regardless, it's bringing you to the same state where you're actually integrating, like meditation, coming back to exactly who you are, your truth, and at least touching on it, not only understanding it, but touching on it. And when you touch on that truth, those traumas, small t's, big t's, kind of don't exist anymore. And it's nice when you can really integrate and understand those traumas in those states and then come out of it a new person, because the trauma never goes away, but the integration becomes new.
My first combat deployment, my daughter was 3 and my son was 5, and that was the hardest thing as a mother that I had to do. Being separated for that length of period from your children was traumatic for me. I was crying half of that deployment during the first 3 months. I was crying almost every day and every night, just, knowing that I was not part of their lives, right? It hardens you in some ways, right? You have to harden yourself, because if you don't, you would fall apart. You can't afford to fall apart while you're out there deployed as a psychiatrist.
We all seem to have different levels of endurance and resiliency. How do we determine our level of personal strength, personal power, and where does that come from?
How do we regain primal agency with ourselves, right? Our agency, our sense of personal power, is related to our ability to listen, to sense, to feel, and then to expand from out there to listen, to sense, to feel what's around us. And if we don't have kind of a practice of doing that, it's so easy to be swept up into this zeitgeist of constant fear, outrage, and, in a sense, an underlying agitation that's not really serving anybody.
There's this pie stand that really isn't close to anything, but I'd heard it was great. And I just casually said to my daughter, I've always wanted to go there. And she goes, why don't we? And the minute I turned off the road into this pie stand, I felt better. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. And so since she had her friend and we were trying to do different things, we went ziplining and we did horseback riding and we did RVing. We did all these things that kind of terrified me. But every time we would do something that I found terrifying, I felt better.
It's very subjective, so two people experiencing or being at the same event may view this situation very differently.
Our bodies are a record of our life experience. One of the ways that we can look at how our bodies are a record of our life experience is that if we are sitting with a memory of something that happened, and we are able to check in with our own body and say, when did I ever feel this way before? Because we might be looking at our heart is pounding, or we're having different sort of physical responses.
I could be one of the people who walk out of the flames carrying water for those who are still burning. And I feel like, people say to me, oh, I lost my dog, but it's not the same. And I want to say all loss is loss. You don't need to, it's not a competition. You don't need to validate it. And if you're in pain and you're sad, and I've learned some things that can help you, I want to share that with you.
Trauma is a strange thing. It's embodied and perseverated on. And the imagination keeps replaying something. Traumatic memory is not accurate to what happened. It's accurate to the way that the body has responded to what happened and continues to.
Stress, trauma, they basically work in the same way of it's a fight or flight or freeze response that cannot be reconciled. So how do we teach people the skills for how they can self-soothe, self-organize, and realize that the way we, in a sense, recondition ourselves from the residue of trauma is through our relationship with ourself, with each other, and with the world.
How does trauma cause stress in our body, and how do we take that negative stress and make it positive?
There's specific things we can do in technologies such as electroceuticals that can very specifically target the left frontal lobe versus the right, and in doing so really personalize treatments. Because when it comes to brain health, we need to be really specific and personalized into, number one, identifying which areas of the nervous system have been traumatized so we can get to the root cause of that. And then, number two, we can apply these neuroplastic treatments. Some examples of neuroplastic treatments are what I call electroceuticals, where we can take like these electrodes as an example and put them, just clip them to our ears. I clipped them to my patient's ears, and we turn on a medical device. It sends gentle electrical signals into the ear, and that sends a signal by way of what we call the vagus nerve to the brainstem. And in doing so, we can help a lot of patients who have like chronic stress, like literally turn off that fight or flight response to something that's a lot more healing and calming.
A stress response is a brilliant response. People have to understand, people hear the word stress, they think there's something wrong with it. And, thank goodness you and I are pre-programmed in our central nervous system to have a stress response. That's what helps us survive. We are seeking pleasure. We are avoiding pain. I'm avoiding the pain of being hungry. I'm avoiding the pain of being eaten, attacked, all that sort of thing. So if I ask myself, if I ask my client, if I ask the wisdom of life on behalf of my client, okay, what's the wisdom that their body's trying to teach them, that their trauma's trying to teach them? How is this the beautiful thing for their growth?
I also see trauma as an opportunity. I've realized that trauma can be used as this tremendous opportunity for deep healing, learning, and growth. Through the miracle of neuroplasticity, we get a second chance. We can rewire our brains so we can rewrite our lives.
Weightlifting, weight bearing, and aerobic exercise, the changes in our body when it comes to our hormones and the epigenetic changes that happen when it comes to our hormones and our adrenal gland is pretty incredible. So this is old school advice, but it goes on and on and on because it's so true what it does to our body. We can handle stress better the more fit we are, both mentally and physically. So exercise is one major thing.
Things like, hydrating and doing some kind of meditative practice and doing some exercise as often as you can. I think sometimes it's choosing the people in your life. I think that if you have a difficult relationship with family, and you feel that you can't cut them out of your life, you need to create a different kind of relationship. I think over the years, as I've gotten busier and with business and kids and everything else, there are people in my life that used to stress me out that aren't part of my life anymore. So I think there are different ways to manage your stress, both in terms of managing your environment. If you know what your triggers are, you can try and avoid them rather than feel that you have to learn to deal with everything.
Not all stress is bad. There are healthy levels of stress. We see that all the time with sports, Olympics, right? People are pumped up. They have the same type of adrenaline going through their system, same glucocorticoid production. But that is more of a challenge response rather than a trauma response or stress response. So we do have this positive side of stress that we don't often talk about. Sometimes we get too focused on the negative impacts, and we don't realize that stress can be good for us. That's what helps us with growth. That's what helps us with resiliency. If we're not challenging ourselves, if we're not pushing ourselves, if we're not inducing some form of stress within us, there is no growth.
Obviously, if we're eating like crap, we're inducing an inflammatory state in our body. If we're inducing an inflammatory state, our body's going to respond. How does it respond? By releasing cortisol. Cortisol doesn't have to be a response to mental stress. Cortisol can also be a response to physical stress. If you exercise too much, you're going to be releasing too much cortisol, it's going to deplete and go down to the ground. The same thing goes if we're experiencing a physical trauma like eating crap over and over and over. That's affecting our cortisol too. There's wonderful herbs called adaptogen herbs, which target our adrenal gland. Adaptogens help the adrenal glands adapt to stress. And there's different ones. And I always tell people to talk to your doctor, but holy basil, schizandra, ginseng, rhodiola, these are amazing herbs that help our adrenal glands adapt to stress, both physical and mental.
I think there are unexpected gifts in every situation, and it's hard to see it as a gift when you're in pain. But the more you can be receptive to the idea that you have choices and that you will have good days, that there will be days that you're genuinely happy, and that in some ways it's almost like going through something so horrible, when you're having a good day, it almost feels better. Like you enjoy it more. Like when my daughter gets back from camp, all my food tastes better to her. The contrast is really pretty strong. And to let yourself, there will be moments of joy, and allow yourself to enjoy them.
That last thought from Jody is beautiful. It's so important to allow yourself to enjoy these deeply human moments in life, despite your pain, and without shame. When someone gets to the point of being suicidal, their trauma has rewired their brain to the point where they're only making decisions in order to end their pain. Here are some key takeaways from this chapter. Traumatic events change our nervous system. If left unchecked, they can shrink our understanding of ourselves and of our life force energy. Traumatic memory is not reflective of the event itself. It is how our body responds to the event and continues to do so. Suicide is an act of desperation by those who feel there is no other way to deal with their pain. Isolating and identifying a traumatic event is the key to understanding and coping with it. Trauma is an opportunity for deep healing, learning, and spiritual growth. By rewiring our brains to understand and cope with trauma, we rewrite our lives. Trauma starts out as a negative experience. Physically, mentally, it's almost like a weed. If left unchecked, trauma will grow and overtake your being.
In many cases, coming to terms with your trauma starts with a powerful, transformative word.
And that word is forgiveness.
Forgiveness of a perpetrator, forgiveness of ourselves, forgiveness of the universe and all that it throws at us, which is a lot these days.
Seriously. I mean, think about the world we're living in right now. The amount of information that's literally flying through space, rushing up from our fingertips and straight into our brains. Daily hits of trauma in 4K color and at 5G speeds. It seems like our definition of normal is shattered on a daily basis. Throw that in with a devastating loss, and it's easy to see how someone can become overwhelmed with grief. Pedram's now going to connect us with two brave women who are currently in their own process of adjusting to the seismic changes of grief.
We're going to hear more from both Jody and Ruchira. Both women are in different stages of working through their trauma, but they're both experiencing life in a new way that incorporates their pain. The shattering of the beliefs we held true before our trauma is a shock to the system. But finding resolution and adapting to a new normal, that's food for the soul and one of the first steps towards spiritual growth.
So with my practice, lifestyle changes are very important, and I start, right from the beginning. The 4 most important lifestyles that I like to start addressing is exercise, sleep, nutrition, and social connectedness. Studies have shown that exercise increases substances called brain-derived neurotropic factors. Those are, if you will, fertilizers for our brain, especially for hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. So it actually helps the nerves to grow.
What we know with trauma is that trauma deadens body responses. Trauma dumbs down our interoceptive capacity to feel our own needs, that it dumbs down, in a sense, our fluid capacity to participate with life.
I hadn't been in therapy in years. I was actually doing really well, and I called my old therapist the day that it happened, and she basically said, all you need to do is sleep, eat, and move. And I thought, well, this is going to be good. I'm really good at moving. I like yoga. I know how to sleep. Eating was challenging. I forced myself to eat because, when you're dealing with trauma, appetite just doesn't. You just don't feel hungry.
Emotional trauma definitely affected my sleep and affected the way I wanted to eat. I lost my appetite, and I just felt like I was disconnected from myself.
Trauma is this way in which the body is hypervigilantly chewing on trying to protect itself from something it wasn't expecting. The problem is that right now, while I'm sitting in this room here with you, there's nothing that I'm in danger of, but my body might continue to perceive that there is.
If you're not sleeping well, if you're not getting that deep quality sleep, we're not going to be able to heal as quickly. We see that so often with not just PTSD, but depression, other mental illnesses, is that if you're not sleeping well, you are not healing.
I really started seeing my body as complete universe almost. Because before, I was doing lots of exercises, yoga, swimming, and the gym, but I didn't see the connection of having a symmetrical body or balance my emotion.
One way to look at trauma is different levels of boundary violation. Either people have had their physical boundaries violated, their sexual boundaries violated, or their emotional boundaries, where people, and it's usually, humanly inflicted trauma is much harder to overcome than a natural disaster, for example, in the sense that there's a trust that's been broken.
After the car accident, I was so out of alignment, and I started getting a pain, and I started seeing myself not the way I wanted to see, and I have to really adjust my body, make my body more symmetrical by paying attention to my daily habits, how I eat, how I sleep, or how I use my body so that I have much more balanced. And by doing that, I started paying more attention to balance in other part of my life too. Like, am I working too hard? Am I doing this too much? Or how's my balance in life? So it was interesting process, because the more I paid attention to my body having a balanced body, the more I start paying attention to my life, having a balance emotionally too.
I would notice, I'm well resourced. Like, I'm fortunate that I'm in this alternate health space. So I knew that essential oils helped me move through grief. And in the beginning, sleeping was really hard, and it would be very intense because it's almost like being in the ocean, like it seems like it's calm, and then suddenly this enormous wave hits and you almost feel like you're going to drown. Like, you don't know how you can move through this much pain. And rose oil is a great example. So I would put it on my heart, and I would just breathe, and I'd say, okay, I'm just going to keep breathing. And it would pass. And then I would think, okay, I know I'm okay for now, but just like, you're in the ocean, like another wave is going to come at some point. So just trying to prepare for that.
The less we can feel, the less we are resilient and able to respond to life. And that is always the conundrum with working with especially severe trauma, which is how to introduce people back to the living experience of their body and their feelings.
When you're a victim of trauma caused by another person, whether it's some type of abuse or neglect abuse, or even an accident that may have caused it, how important is forgiveness in becoming whole again and moving past the actual event?
Forgiveness is a hard part in the healing journey. Some people move through forgiveness quickly because it's part of their religion or part of who they are. But sometimes forgiveness is that final hurdle. And how does forgiveness help you when you've been traumatized or hurt? It is a way to have acceptance and move through really that grieving process of whatever incident that you had. And when you forgive somebody, you bring back the power to you.
In my experience, from my own adversities and traumas that I've experienced, as well as talking and working with people, forgiveness is part of healing, in my opinion, especially forgiving ourselves, right? It might be difficult to forgive a perpetrator, especially if there is a significant, horrendous, horrific crime, right? Sometimes, that piece may not be readily available for us to start with. But we can start with ourselves.
I think that I had a lot of fears and self-limiting beliefs. I was raised to be polite and not question people and kind of be a good little girl. And I think that having your world blow up, you re-examine everything. And so I feel like I'm being braver, because now I really realize life is short. And also I want to do something to honor his legacy. And I feel like whatever limitations I might have placed on myself before, I'm letting go of and really allowing myself to take on new things, to, be interviewed for a docuseries, to, I have a book deal now, to just go for things that I would have maybe prevented myself from doing before. So I don't think I'm done. I think it's an ongoing evolution.
Really important to remember that we all have our own ways, and sometimes in the kind of the fix-it mentality of culture, we want to find these precise prescriptions. And once again, life is way too diverse and mysterious to really know what gets us through.
I was a shy, overweight young girl in India where I was taught by my mom and my grandmother that being a shy, timid, obedient girl was a good quality. And so that's what I grew up with. And so for me to be able to overcome that and start to learn to speak up and be assertive and, find my way through life has been quite a journey. Trauma gives us this new purpose and meaning that we would not have had. When we look back at our lives, we'll see that the most that we have grown are through those challenging times or those traumatic times have helped us to be the most resilient.
It's a little bit like the wave analogy, right? My son used to love to play in the waves, and you can do one of three things with the waves. You can let it completely carry you in, and you're covered in sand. You can try to actively ride it in, so you jump and very intentionally go with it. Or you can go under it. And I didn't know that. When I was a kid, somehow no one ever told me you can dunk under the wave and then you don't get tossed around. And so I think that's a valuable lesson in navigating tragedy, that you have choices. I think that so often with grief, we feel like victims. And I think the difference between being a victim and being empowered is knowing that you have choices.
If we can go through it where we actually stay connected to our body, we might feel a little tingling, we might feel some discomfort, we might feel some tension come up. And as we stay with it with care and love and support, we'll feel some kind of release and integrate that experience so we're not carrying it with us as something that we're needing to not forget.
I haven't done anything big and great like I would want to do with this, but that's still something that's going to be in the future for me. But at least I'm here and I'm talking about this, which is much more than I can say, I mean, it's sad because my mom doesn't understand. I mean, she lost her husband to cancer, and then here's her daughter losing her husband to suicide, but she doesn't know how to even approach this topic. She doesn't talk about it. She has not sat down with me to talk about this, and those are painful things, right? When you're struggling with this in isolation.
When something awful happens to you outside of your control, it is a very frightening thing. We are used to feeling so empowered, and whether it's an incident of violence where somebody took your power from you or assault, whatever the situation is, when trauma happens, you've lost control. And when you can forgive that person, that incident, however you want to call it, you restore your power, and it really is an incredible way to empower a person and feel better to move through and move away from that constant struggle with the traumatic event.
When you're able to forgive yourself, when you're able to work through that guilt and shame, there is a sense of relief. Once we forgive ourselves, some of these negative feelings, and guilt and shame and all that leaves us, and we're able to then heal and grow. And that's typically what I guess forgiveness looks like, yeah.
So we hear that trauma can stick around in our thoughts and our bodies for a really long time. What are some changes we can do in our everyday life that can help people to recover?
Well, I think it's getting away from this sort of medicalized view of human experience where we call things disorders. I think that everything can have positive and negative effects on us, and learning, like I said, there's a value in going through depression. So there's a whole approach that is that we need to make any painful feelings go away. And I think there's a real value in going through painful feelings and coming out stronger in the other end.
I think that certain people, it's not so much that I changed, it's that certain people can't show up, or they like this idea of you being kind of a puddle in the corner. And that was not what I was going to be. So I think the hardest thing was, it's almost like you get a scarlet letter, like you're the mother whose son died in a car accident. And so for the rest of your life, you can never be the same. You always have to be sad. And so recognizing those projections and not showing up the way people wanted me to, being able to almost look through like a glass mirror, a glass sliding door, and say like, oh, that's what they want of me, but that's not how I feel. So I'm okay disappointing them. I'm okay letting them expect me to be pathetic and sad all the time. And I have moments when I'm sad, but I don't necessarily feel like I need to, when I run into you in the bank and you give me that, oh, I don't need to match that. I don't need to be the pathetic person in the bank. I can say like, actually, I'm having a good day right now,
And you don't have to give up, or forget. It's not that you're condoning or forgetting what's happened to you. You're just simply integrating all the negatives that's happened, but also looking at the positives. And each time you look at more of the positive, it becomes less traumatizing. So the goal is to move more closer towards the positive aspects and how it has helped us to grow and given us new meaning and purpose. But at the same time, also integrating the negative aspects so we don't forget, we learn from it, and we hopefully avoid future exposures to similar trauma.
I guess that's the message I would like to share, is that, you always have choices, and you can always, obviously I would give anything to have like one more day, one more minute with my baby, but that's not one of my options. So I have to look at other options, and I have to really see how when one door closes, other things open up. and kind of allow myself to ride that wave.
It's a gift that you've had to learn this and you've had to heal. And so what I would say to those who are watching this, who are concerned about their own traumas and concerned about the work that they need to do or want to do and the support that they need to get or want to get, is that they can understand something that so many people are going through from the inside that allows them to have empathy that you wouldn't have if you weren't going through this. And your journey towards healing is an honor, because you can help other people heal in a way that you wouldn't if you didn't have to go through it.
The idea that trauma dumbs down our ability to feel our own needs is what prevents us from living in the moment. That's where real joy is experienced. The less we exist in the moment, the less resilient our bodies and minds become. But finding the gifts in trauma isn't a one-step process. Let's take a look at some of the key things to remember from this segment. First, the absolute basics. Eat, sleep, move. After a trauma, these fundamental activities are hard to do or easy to forget. Focus on small goals. That includes eating, sleeping, and movement, so this is really a win-win exercise. Be aware. Recognize what you're doing, even if it's just lying down. Become hyper-aware of your surroundings in a literal sense. Recognize the value of your pain and the opportunity it presents to come out stronger. Trauma is an opportunity to behave differently. In the future, something will trigger your trauma. Only now can you control your reaction. That's power. Surround yourself with love. It's easy to forget, but it really is the best medicine. If you're enjoying our series, please click the button below this video right here and find out how you can bring all 9 episodes of the Trauma docuseries, plus a bunch of powerful bonus resources into your home with a subscription to Whole TV. Every one of us deserves to know the full spectrum of healing options that are out there for us. And the information in this series is something you could come back to time and again, be it for your own healing or that of a family member or your friends. You can get this all-access package at a special discounted price during this event only. So now is the time to upgrade and become a full member of Whole TV. We've worked hard to put this and several other powerful series and films together in a single place where you can get access to expert advice and heal your life. Join today. The gift of pain is growth. Hearing the stories our friends have shared about breaking through their pain is inspirational.
Inspirational and aspirational. We see so many people make it to the other side of their trauma and discover a new sense of purpose and a strong desire to pay it forward.
I guess that's why we're both here doing what we're doing.
Speaking of which, we were all really moved by the episode that's coming up next.
In the upcoming episode, we will continue to explore emotional trauma, only this time through the lens of tragedy.
Yes. From the lingering emotional and physical complications of childhood loss and neglect to the harrowing story of one woman's terrifying ordeal and how her recovery involved her entire family coming together to heal. It's a powerful episode that you do not want to miss.
Let's face it, working through trauma, it's hard work.
Sometimes it seems easier to cowboy up and fight through the pain, but it's a losing game and it can cut your life short.
We hope you've gotten a lot out of this episode about grief, healing, and letting go, and embracing a new life with clarity, purpose, and a better understanding of our trauma.
Our commitment is to cover the topic of trauma in a comprehensive manner, so you have the best information available to begin your healing journey. We'll see you next time.
Bye for now.